This chapter explores the various models, theories, and contributing factors of substance use disorders. The models provide a framework for understanding substance abuse, while the contributing factors help in the treatment strategies that may be implemented. I recommend that you complete the worksheet in the Files menu to help you explore your own model and theoretical orientation of substance abuse as we go through these slides. The worksheet is also located on the module page for the chapter PowerPoint. By the end of the chapter, you will be able to explain the relationship between the drive to alter consciousness and drug and alcohol use. Other learning objectives are listed on the slides. Your textbook says that there are 4 primary drives to human behavior: hunger, thirst, sex for procreation, and our desire to alter consciousness. You also just watched the video in the last module from Dr. Waller, who describes 3 primary needs: food, water, and dopamine. Sex and anything that feels good goes here. As Dr. Waller described in the video, though, as we increase our dopamine production over time, the dopamine becomes less and less efficient, ultimately creating a substance use disorder. We cannot isolate one specific cause of alcoholism or drug addiction. There are often multiple confounding reasons for addiction in an individual patient or client. Most likely, a matrix of genetic, social, psychological, and environmental factors can cause an individual to develop problems with alcohol and drugs. Clients or patients are all different, with different coping skills, family histories, physical traits, affective, emotional temperaments, personality traits, and developmental histories. Studying the models will make you aware that factors that play a major role in one individual's substance use might play no role at all in another person's drug problems. One size does not fit all. The tension reduction theory involves the concept of homeostasis or balance. The individual will use alcohol and drugs to counteract or balance out stress, anxiety, emotional tension, and conflict. Stress is just the modern version of tension, so alcohol and drugs are used as tension reducers. The clients describe this as, "I just drink to calm down. I need to relax. I can avoid the conflicts. It helps me not to think so much. It makes me feel better." This tension reduction theory may be especially applicable to those individuals who are already genetically predisposed to alcoholism or substance use disorders. Many individuals who have the genetic factors describe their first drink or drug use as instantaneous pleasure or instant relaxation. Here's some words on the etiological model. The American Psychological Association defines trauma as directly experiencing or witnessing an event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury or other threat to physical integrity, or learning that a family member or close associate has experienced such events and has a response that involves intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Traumatic stressors that fit this definition include disasters, motor vehicle accidents, emergency worker exposed to trauma, war, rape and sexual assault, intimate partner violence, stalking, torture, prostitution, and sex trafficking, life-threatening illness, and child abuse. Substance use and abuse is an attempt by the individual to assuage feelings related to traumatic experiences. The individual self-medicates by trying to numb out, soothe, or escape the overwhelming feelings of pain, hopelessness, and shame associated with the trauma. Continued substance use and abuse, however, puts the individual at risk for further traumatic situations, thus compounding the initial trauma history. In 1957, the American Medical Association declared alcoholism a disease on the basis of 3 criteria. Alcoholism has a known etiology or cause, drinking alcohol, and the symptoms get worse over time, and alcoholism has known outcomes. The outcomes of alcoholism are physical dependence, tolerance and withdrawal, physical symptoms such as liver problems, cirrhosis, stomach ulcers, and other physical symptoms, and eventual death. This disease model is the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous and many other self-help programs. However, remember, Alcoholics Anonymous was founded in the 1930s. The shame-based stigma of addiction, along with the guilt, negative feelings, and spiritual bankruptcy, makes the 12-step approach of Alcoholics Anonymous an effective recovery tool. The disease model also takes away the shame and stigma, which is a good thing. If you are not familiar with the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, here they are listed out. See if you can identify the themes of the disease model within the 12 steps. What other theories or contributing factors can you identify in the steps? In 1997, Dr. Alan Leshner, then director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, published what has become a seminal article on how we conceptualize substance use and addiction. Until then, it had largely been considered a problem of self-discipline or a moral failing. Part of what he says in the article is this sentence here. Recognizing addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use can impact society's overall health and social policy strategies and help diminish the health and social costs associated with drug abuse and addiction. What parts of this statement strike you as being important and why? Well, typically people point out the part that says chronic relapsing brain disorder, or perhaps compulsive drug seeking and use, or diminish health and social costs. While decades of research have revealed addiction to be a disease that alters the brain, we now know that while the initial decision to use drugs is voluntary, drug addiction is a disease of the brain that compels a person to become singularly obsessed with obtaining and using drugs despite their many adverse and life consequences. Addiction is similar to other chronic diseases. Using imaging technology to measure metabolism, in this case glucose uptake, in the brain, which is on the left, and the heart, which is on the right, one can see that both addiction and heart disease produce observable changes in organ functioning. In each pair of images shown above, the healthy organ shows greater activity, reds and yellows, than the diseased organ. In drug addiction, it is the frontal cortex, which is part of the brain associated with judgment and decision making, is significantly affected. Like heart disease, drug addiction can be prevented and treated successfully. If left untreated, however, its effects can last a lifetime. Advances in medicine and scientific techniques have given researchers a clearer idea of what addiction is, including magnetic resonance imaging, MRIs, positron emission tomography, PET, and advanced genetic research. On a fundamental level, addiction is a brain disease, but it is not just a brain disease. No single factor determines whether a person will become addicted to drugs. The overall risk for addiction is impacted by the biological makeup of the individual. It can even be influenced by gender or ethnicity, by his or her developmental stages, and their surrounding social environment, such as conditions at home, at school, and in the neighborhood. Addiction also has a strong genetic component. It is estimated that between 40 to 60% of an individual's vulnerability to substance use disorders is due to genetic factors. For instance, there may be a gene or genes that are turned on by environmental factors in childhood. As with any other disease, vulnerability to substance use disorders differs from person to person. In general, the more risk factors an individual has, the greater the chance that taking drugs will lead to abuse and a substance use disorder. Scientists estimate that the genetic factors account for between 40 and 60% of a person's vulnerability, including the effects of the environment on gene expression and function. The genetic model of alcoholism involves adoption and twin studies. The adoption studies indicate that children with a biological parent with substance use disorders are more likely to become alcoholics than other adoptive children without alcoholic biological parents. The effects of adoption studies are strongest for boys. Twin studies involve looking at identical twins who have the same genetic makeup and fraternal twins, not the same genes, and comparing the effects of the alcoholic parents. If we look at the alcoholic parent passing their genes to the identical twins, then we would expect a high concordance rate in the identical twins. However, if we look at the alcoholic parent passing their genes to the two different twins, we would expect a lower concordance rate in the outcome of the twins. And that is what happens. There appears to be a genetic factor of alcoholism, but it is not 100%. The concept of an addictive personality is a simplistic approach that makes the mistake of labeling all alcoholics and other addicts as possessing a particular personality that leads to addictive and compulsive behaviors. This theory has not been validated. It may be more correct to say that some individuals have psychological vulnerabilities that make a pattern of substance abuse more likely to develop. These vulnerabilities are harm avoidant, reward dependent, and novelty seeking. In addition, research has been conducted on personality disorders as diagnosed in the DSM-5 and the correlation to substance use disorders. The highest correlation exists between narcissism and borderline personality disorders. If you hear the phrases from the client, such as, "I'm angry and drugs quiet me," "It's hard for me to get close to others without drugs," "I'm bored and isolated and drugs help soothe me," this might be indicative of a personality disorder. Attachment plays a key role in being vulnerable to problems with alcohol and drugs. The bond between a parent and child is a pivotal foundation in feeling safe, nurtured, and connected. The inability to establish long-lasting, gratifying relationships is directly related to early attachment styles. Disruptions in attachment create problems in connection. The individual then uses alcohol and drugs to compensate for this dissatisfaction and to alleviate pain, further pushing others away while experiencing deep feelings of isolation. The self-medication motive is a purposeful attempt by the user to assuage painful emotional states and to manage psychological problems and disorders. Inherent in the self-medication motive is that the drug the user chooses needs to be related to a cure for the problem or mood. For example, taking cocaine to alleviate depression or to slow down ADHD symptoms makes sense. Using marijuana to alleviate the voices in my head for schizophrenia is not really related to the symptoms and so is not tied to the self-medication motive. If you believe the self-medication motive is present, then you would, as the counselor, work to identify why they are taking the drugs and then help them find better ways to cope with the emotional problems. For example, if they were using cocaine to alleviate depression, then maybe antidepressants would be a better medication solution. This table illustrates the various drug types and their effects. So in this table, you can see that marijuana in fact stimulates senses and stimulates thoughts. So using marijuana to slow down the voices in their heads does not make sense under the self-medication theory because marijuana makes that symptom worse, not better. Similar to the self-medication theory, the person who starts taking alcohol or other drugs to assuage the negative effects of a mood or affective disorder can be led by those drugs into a spiraling pattern of isolation and interpersonal distancing. This isolation exacerbates the affective disorders. This pattern can also lead to social phobias and paranoid ideation. The phrases to listen to in the patient who are contributing alcohol or drug use to problems in the family include, "I drink because I come from a dysfunctional family," or "My mom drank a lot," or "I feel neglected." In addition to the genetic predisposition that was discussed earlier, the family theory also includes the modeling of family members who use alcohol and drugs, greatly influences the development of this coping skill for the children. Parents with substance use disorders also have extreme difficulty in being effective parents. Parents with drug and alcohol problems are ill-equipped to provide the kind of patient, dedicated care necessary for children to develop and grow with a healthy sense of self-esteem. For more information about the risk factors associated with adolescent abuse of drugs, see the article in the file menu under Handouts. If you are interested in working with adolescents and adults with poor self-concept and believe this to be related to their drug or alcohol use, here are some ways to intervene. Boredom is often cited as a major factor in alcohol and drug use by adolescents and adults. Surprisingly, there has been very little research to date into the nature of the relationship between boredom and alcohol and drug problems. The recent emphasis in the treatment field has been on using meditation practices and mindfulness training is directly related to teaching people how to be more present and aware and to be able to deal more effectively with boredom by showing up and being present. If you hear the phrase, "It seemed like a good idea at the time," it might be an indication that the individual is using drugs impulsively. The risk-taking behavior of using drugs creates feelings of rebellion, aggression, rage, self-destructiveness, and aliveness, or an adrenaline rush. The problems that result from these risk-taking behaviors lead to a vicious cycle of taking more alcohol and drugs to alleviate the feelings of pain, anxiety, and depression. Phrases that you might hear from the clients or patients that indicate a social learning theory orientation may be needed are, "It's fun to use and be with friends." "It's peer pressure." "It's cool to use and chill out." A variety of models theories can be considered psychosocial or social learning theories. Social learning theories include cognitive theories, social modeling, rational emotive behavioral therapy, CBT, behavioral therapy, etc. The determinants of addictive behavior are situational and environmental factors, beliefs and expectations, and family history and prior learning experiences with the substances. Emphasis is also placed on the consequences of addictive behavior to understand its reinforcement and punishing features. Are there rewards to the use of alcohol and drug? Besides the effects of alcohol, it is also important to discern the social interpersonal reactions that the individual experiences before, during, and after engaging in the drug-using behavior. Social factors are important in both the acquisition and later performance of the addictive behavior. For example, are there triggers which lead to continued use or relapse? The acquisition of new skills and cognitive strategies in a self-management program can result in changes in addictive behavior to new, more adaptive behaviors, which come under control of cognitive processes of awareness and decision making. Accordingly, the individual can assume and accept a greater degree of responsibility for changing their addictive behavior. If the drinking behavior is learned, it can be unlearned. Or if the drinking behavior was learned, then you can relearn other coping strategies to stop the drinking. Societies, cultures, communities, socioeconomic groups, and even neighborhoods offering fewer limited alternatives to drinking and drugging as tension relievers are more susceptible to addiction. Where there is no limit on supply and distribution, attitudes are liberal and the cost is relative, the incidence of alcohol and drug abuse is high. For example, where there are an abundance of bars in a downtown area, the abuse of alcohol is high in the corridor. Consider what this means as we begin to set up ordinances for the location of marijuana dispensaries. The attitudes of the culture and ethnic customs may facilitate patterns of alcohol and drug use. For example, in some Latino cultures, the men are positively sanctioned for drinking to intoxication, thus resulting in a high pattern of alcohol abuse. The lack of opportunity or hope that one can achieve the American dream can contribute to feelings of despair that lead to alcoholism or drug addiction. This is the socio-cultural model. Psychoanalytic models are generally linked to the fixation at the oral stage of development. Alcohol and drugs frequently denote power or the feeling of powerful to users. The expression getting high symbolizes feeling above others or above one's usual sense of self. Ironically, despite the original reason for using drugs to feel powerful, the ultimate state in the cycle of addiction makes the individual powerless. Alcohol and drugs also have important symbolic, seduction, and sexual meanings. Think of the advertising for alcohol and tobacco products. Practically all drugs and alcohol have been described as aphrodisiacs. Unfortunately, no drug is truly an aphrodisiac. Alcohol and drugs may reduce inhibitions, stimulate sexual arousal at low doses. However, alcohol and other drugs impair sexual performance, especially with prolonged use of the drug. Drugs are a way to quiet, distract, or escape existential issues and to gain a temporary relief and change in focus or perspective. However, it is temporary and a passive approach that doesn't resolve any issues but often leads to more drug use and perhaps to a vicious pattern of substance abuse and/or addiction. You can certainly see how pessimism is a contributing factor to alcohol and drug use. The alcoholic addict's sarcasm and sarcastic sense of humor underlie a negative worldview. Procrastination about organizing, cleaning up, or dealing with one's life is an ongoing aspect of this pessimistic view. Now on to the discussion forum. Take the chapter quiz and then on to chapter 3. Good luck!